important day. Today, we're entering the Triodian. We remember the publican and the Pharisee for our edification. We celebrate the return of St. John's relics. We celebrate all the holy new martyrs and confessors of Russia. Brothers and sisters, I'm so happy to bring you some of St. John's treasures. St. John Chrysostom, the great orator. I want to speak a little bit today about what he has to say about the publican and the Pharisee. St. John, our good father of golden mouth, he is speaking about humble-mindedness and the publican and the Pharisee. Begins with a sports analogy that would have made a lot of sense in his time. He says that there are two chariots that are yoked. One is driven by the Pharisee and another is driven by the publican. And though the Pharisee's chariot is better and his horses are faster, he comes in last to the publican, who wins, who overtakes him. Because the Pharisee, though he is a better driver, and the publican a poorer one, he is weighed down by his pride, and so he crashes or comes in last. Our Father John, speaking about the horror of pride and how much damage it does, speaks of the Pharisee as a great ship loaded with beautiful things, with marvelous wares and wonderful things, spices, gold, and it travels across an arduous sea, a very hard sea, with storms and tempests, only to sink in the harbor when it arrives. Because though the Pharisee was very superior to the publican, and though he possessed many virtues, because he says, I fast twice a week, and I tithe what I have, and yet he is dragged down by his pride. He is like that icon of the ladder of divine ascent that we see, in which men are climbing the ladder, and yet there's a man falling off near the very top of the ladder. Sure, one is at the top receiving the crown, but one not a few rungs down is actually falling off the ladder, plucked off because of his pride. For though he has gained many virtues, he did not master his pride, and thus falls. And yet, I have to say I was a little surprised, because I oftentimes find myself in sympathy with the publican, and we kind of are in the narrative of the readings. And yet St. John has no sympathy for the publican. He says he's a wretched sinner. And that's actually the truth. So often we sympathize with the publican too much without realizing who he truly is. The publican is a miserable man. He is a wretched man. He is a man who steals from his neighbors. It would be like an IRS agent who comes to your house personally to collect taxes, and then instead of giving you the number he has been given by the state, jacks it up by a few percentages to make his income. And his percentages are whatever he arbitrarily sets. And if you don't pay his rates, you'll be dragged into the streets and mutilated publicly. Right? You'll face very harsh justice. This is what the publican is doing. He's extorting his fellow Jews. He's robbing them. Is he working hard for his money? No, he's taking it from those who do work hard. So, the truth be told, the publican is a miserable man who has no virtues. He doesn't have any. And yet, the publican cries out to the Lord and is received. Why? Because he has some humility. In fact, St. John Chrysostom even says this. He says, real humility is not for a sinful man to say, I'm a sinner. That's true. Real humility is when a man who is full of virtues, who is doing the works of God at all times, says, though many good works may show forth from me, I am nothing, because everything comes from Christ. That's true humility. So here the publican does not even have full humility. But St. John Chrysostom adds to that statement. He says, but there are those who, though being sinful, confess their sins to the Lord. And because they turn their hearts towards him, seeking to have union with him, he is compassionate and he receives them. So it is with the publican. And so it is with the greatness of humility. Right? And yet with pride we can speak more of its evil, right? The Pharisee has virtues, and yet his virtues become vices. And that's exactly what happens with pride. A man reads the scriptures intensely out of pride, and it does not do him any good, but rather it does him evil. A man fasts out of delusion, thinking, I will become great by my fasting. And by his fasting he'll be dragged down to hell, because God will not receive it, will rather reject him and his fasting. In the Old Testament, there were many times in which the Jews would offer God sacrifices, which God had commanded, and God would say, I hate your sacrifices. I hate them. I hate your incense. I hate your sacrifices. I don't want them anymore, because they were offered impurely. So it is with the proud man. So even the proud man's virtues become the means for his own destruction. While humility will lift a man out of the abyss. Even a man who's in hell, humility will pluck him out. Now, St. John doesn't say this, nor neither do I, to spur people on to indolence, to say, oh, the virtues, we don't need them. I'll just be humble. St. John doesn't say this, and neither do I, because St. John adds, if humility is able to raise up a man loaded down with dead works, like the publican, what will humility do with a man who actually has virtues? St. John says, through how many heavens will it not pass? By the throne of God, surely it will stay its course, in the midst of angels with much confidence. So the man who has good works and he has humility, there's no end to where he will go. But the man who has pride, we don't know how deep he will go. We don't actually know. In fact, it would be like a man who has a lead weight tied to his legs, and the lead weight is thrown off the ship, and the chain snaps taut and he goes off the ship too. It does not matter how good of a swimmer he is, or how long he can hold his breath, he will go down. So it is with all who have pride, brothers and sisters. Pride is so powerful, says St. John, that it overcame the greatest angel. Lucifer was overcome by pride. And yet he was so much wiser, so much more intelligent than man, so much greater, and yet pride overthrew him. But through humility, a thief went into heaven before the apostles did. The apostle was not the first to go into heaven. It was the thief who did, because he was humble. Brothers and sisters, I want to speak about St. John now and his feast, this feast of the translation of his relics, because it's very relevant to this discussion. We know a lot about St. John. St. John, I'll say quickly for those who don't know, was born of a noble family in Antioch. When his mother died, he left his estate and became a monk. And he was a very hard monk, a very harsh monk. In fact, he only lasted a few years because he destroyed his body with intense asceticism and intense austerities. In fact, for an entire year, he lived in this cave where he didn't want to sleep. So he tied a rope around his waist and hooked it to the ceiling so that even when he did fall asleep, he would be standing while he was reading the scriptures because he was so intense. And in fact, when the winter came, his friends from Antioch came and pulled him out of the cave, half frozen, half starved, and carried him back to the city, where they revived him. The bishop, of course, captured him and made him a reader, a deacon, then a priest. And he began to preach at the bishop's command, and he was a great preacher. He was so beloved in the city that when Emperor Arcadius, who was in Constantinople, found that his archbishop had died and he needed a new archbishop for Constantinople, all he heard was John, John, John. So he said he will be the next patriarch, the next archbishop. But St. John was so popular that the only way they could get him out of the city of Antioch was to take him in the middle of the night with soldiers and armed guards and brought him out of the city to Constantinople. When he arrived in Constantinople, he was ordained by a man, he was consecrated by a man named Theophilus, Patriarch of Alexandria, who did not want to consecrate him because he had his own desires as to who should be patriarch, one of his men. But they forced him to do it, so he did. And St. John said to everyone, he said, I'm the bishop of the city. And my job is to correct everyone. I will correct everything that I see is wrong. Because he was a man who was ramrod straight. There was no curves in him. There was nothing bent in him. He said, I will correct everything that I see is wrong, including you, O Emperor. I'll correct you too. I'll correct you if I see that you're in error. Because it's my job to do so. This boldness led him into some clashes with people in the city, nonetheless. Especially a woman named Eudoxia, who was the empress. Eudoxia was a very beautiful woman, but unfortunately she didn't have interior beauty. She was very vain, she was incredibly proud, she was power-hungry, manipulative, and she was very greedy. And she would steal land and property from those who were less powerful, and she would use her power to do it. And St. John was oftentimes battling with her, telling her, just like the Holy Prophet told Jezebel and Ahab, you can't take Naboth's vineyard. So she wanted to take a vineyard that belonged to a widow. It was quite ugly. So she, eventually getting tired of St. John, conspired with Theophilus and had him removed from the city. They had him tried at this trumped-up council, and they had him deposed and taken out. But as soon as he was removed, earthquakes began to shake the city, and the empress, screaming, had him called back. So he came back, and things seemed to be okay for a little while, until a statue of the empress was built right outside the cathedral. And that was a little bit too much. And St. John spoke about vanity again. And this time the empress had had enough, and St. John was forced to take the long road to the Caucasus. St. John was a very sick man. He actually had to have warm baths. He had to eat a very special diet because his stomach was ruined, and he had a lot of problems. In fact, making him walk across the country basically was meant to kill him. And he walked under horrendous circumstances, and he left the city and departed. And the empress did not get away scot-free either. She died a horrendous death. She died in this kind of putrid state in which her insides rotted out. They talked about the stench of being near her was horrendous. Worms began to crawl out of her. It was pretty bad. She died in this horrendous state. And what's quite sad about this is because St. John was probably one of the greatest men the church has produced, one of them. So this woman, being empress, could have called upon him any time of the day to ask for his counsel and advice. She could have gone to him at any moment, and being the empress, he would have been obliged to help her. She could have been saved so easily. She could have gone to St. John of the Golden Mouth and said to him, "Father, what advice do you have for me? How should I change my life? How should I live in such a way as to gain God's favor?" And he could so easily have helped her. And in fact, had she done so, we would probably have an icon somewhere of St. Eudoxia, Empress of Constantinople, beloved spiritual daughter of St. John Chrysostom. But instead, she's one of the most reviled people in the history of the church, probably. And her husband too, actually, because Emperor Arcadius, never did anything to really quench this. And in fact, it got a lot worse for the empress, because when they buried her, the historians of that time say that her grave would literally shake. In fact, she was put into the earth near this church, and all the area around her tomb would just shake incessantly, just tremble all the time. And people were afraid to go there, because her coffin was shaking, the ground was shaking, everything was trembling. And the impression you get is that her sufferings in the next life were so awful that even her body was quaking in this one. Her son chose to take a humble path, and he chose to bring St. John Chrysostom back. And St. John was brought back by ship, and this is the feast we celebrate today, in which his ship returns, carrying his relics, and the emperor and many, many people. The whole harbor is full of boats, of people holding candles and lamps with incense, and the emperor, the new emperor, boards the ship that St. John is on, and he does prostrations to St. John, and he reads him a huge prayer saying, "Forgive me, forgive this city, forgive my parents, and pray that they be taken out of hell. Have mercy, O St. John." So St. John is received in humility by the people of the city. As the reader read earlier, his coffin is taken back to the cathedral, and he was, in a sense, ceremonially humiliated. So when they bring him back, there's a ceremony of his reestablishment. His relics are taken and put back on the throne, and from within the coffin they hear this voice say, "Peace be to all," from inside his coffin. They then took his coffin and they laid it on the quaking grave of the empress, and the grave stopped quaking. Which means he must have forgiven her, or alleviated some of her sufferings. So we can see the danger of pride, brothers and sisters. The empress could so easily have found salvation. Salvation was right in front of her. She doesn't have the excuse that some people have, where they say, I can't be saved because my priest is a drunkard, or he's evil, or he's a heretic, or maybe he's just mediocre. No, she had one of the best priests, one of the best bishops there has ever been, as the bishop of her city. And yet she could not be saved there because of her pride. It's like Judas being with Christ. Judas was not only greedy. Greed cannot do something that diabolical. Judas must have also had pride. Because yet last Sunday, when I preached on Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus had greed, and he had a lot of it. He was like the publican. He was corrupt and evil. But one word from Christ, and Zacchaeus' greed melted like that. Zacchaeus had no pride. He was climbing the tree to see Christ. Zacchaeus had humility. That's why he was able to receive Christ as a guest in his house. That's why the publican is elevated. That's why Eudoxia's son is shown mercy by God. Right? And today we also celebrate the holy new martyrs and confessors of Russia who suffered in every way. Some of them were drowned, some of them were shot, some of them were beaten to death, some of them starved to death, some of them died from exposure, some of them were tortured, and then they survived as confessors. But how did they do this? Through their own strength? No. No one has the strength to endure those inhuman things. They endured these things because they had faith in Christ and they had humility. And Christ, seeing their humility, filled them with grace and said to them, "You are worthy to become martyrs in my kingdom. You are worthy to receive these crowns because you are humble and you have faith." So brothers and sisters, it does not behoove us to be proud. Let us run after humility and seek it with all of our heart, that we may find grace from God. And when the proud one comes to make us proud, and to tempt us to be arrogant, we should say to him the words that Christ spoke today. "For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted." Amen.